So in this video we're going to set up and configure the HP P4000 VSA. This is a virtual appliance that runs the left-hand OS. This is the same as a physical appliance or physical nodes, P4000s, P4300, P4500s that you would typically use if you were going physical. We're going to go through and set these up so we can use them in this demo. So we're going to power these two on here. We're going to do the initial setup and get them ready for the CMC management console to be able to use these. So as you can see, they're booting up in VMware Workstation right now, and as soon as they get to a login prompt, we'll go ahead and get these things configured and get them added to the CMC in this video. So we're at the login prompt now. As you can see, it says type in start and hit enter to log in. So we're going to do as it says. Click start. We're going to click log in. Under the configuration options, you see general settings. You can add administrators and change passwords. I don't recommend doing this right now. We're going to do this from the CMC when we build the cluster and add these nodes in. So what we're concerned about right now and what we want to set up is the IP settings. I would recommend only doing Ethernet 0 at this time. You can configure Ethernet 1 in a load balance team and bond those NICs together from the CMC at when you get to that configuration stage. So right now let's go to Ethernet 1 or Ethernet 0, and we're going to go in to configuration. I've already configured the host name on this one. I had to reboot this thing, so what you would normally see, we'll see on the VSA 2 when we get to that point. But right now, you just give it a host name, whatever you want to call it. For this demo, we're going to use P4K01.lab.local, which is the domain that we're, or the DNS domain name that we're using for our lab. So we're going to tab through, and we're going to say obtain IP address using DHCP. If you wanted to use a static IP, you could, and enter that. I typically, when I set up P4000 nodes, I will use static IP addresses for obvious reasons, but you can use DHCP as well. It works just fine. You just need to note and keep track of your IP addresses. So we're going to use DHCP for this demo, so we're going to select that, hit OK. And are we sure? Yes, we are. It's going to contact DHCP and get an IP. So now it's got an IP. We're going to open up Notepad here and get this IP address added so we don't forget what it is. So it is 192.168.202.139. Whoops. 139. Then we'll go back into here, say OK, and back, and we're going to log out. So now we've got the second VSA powered up. We're going to click start again, log in, again TCP, Ethernet 0, and this is what the default looks like. You got localhost.local domain and disable interface. So we're going to go through and we're going to call this guy P4K02.lab.local. And we're going to tab through. Again, it's tab. Try to hit the arrow keys. It just sits there. So we're going to obtain an IP address again and hit OK. Are you sure? Yes. And we've got an IP on the second node, and it is 192.168.202.140. So we'll hit OK, hit back, and log out. Now we're going to open up the CMC. centralized management console. And now that you have the CMC open, as you can see, this is a default, never been ran, what it looks like by default. So what we're going to do is we're going to click add IP address so we can discover our nodes that we just configured. And we're going to copy this and say OK. It's found it. We're going to go in and add our second node. Click add, paste it in, and they are both found. So now you have your CMC open and you have two available systems. If you click on them, obviously you can click log in. There's no username password by default to log into these guys initially. Obviously you can't really use them right now. So what we're going to do is go in here and we are going to get these things configured. So we're going to right click on the first one and we're going to add to a new management group. If you already had a cluster and a management group, you would add to existing if you wanted to, or like we're going to do in this demo, we're going to add to a new management group. So we're going to call this management group. You can call it whatever you want. We're going to call it, let's call it lab .local demo. Let's just call it lab.local. And now we're going to so we selected both nodes, and as you can see we got a message down here that says continue without installing a FOM, which is a failover manager. We're going to select the checkbox to acknowledge that we know that we're not using this in this config, which is fine. If you were doing this production, you probably would want to run a FOM. Again, that's a failover manager that basically resides outside of this, and it will help with failover and etc. for the cluster. So we're going to check that box, hit next. We're going to give a username, call it admin, and we're going to give it a password and hit next. And if you wanted to use NTP, which I highly recommend, I do not have an NTP server running right now, so we're going to manually set the time. And as you can see, it's accurate for my time zone currently. And hit next. DNS domain name on the next screen. So we're going to call it lab.local. And our DNS server is, give it a set up your email notifications, give it an IP or host name of your SMTP server, server port, sender address, where you're sending it from. I'm not going to set this up right now. And now we're on to what type of cluster you want to build. We're going to set up a standard cluster in this setup. If you wanted to get into, say, a stretch cluster with VMware, you would get into multi-site clustering. We're not going into that right now, so we're just going to do a standard cluster at this time, and we're going to click next and give it a cluster name. So let's call this lab cluster. And you can see on a RAID configuration where it says RAID virtual. This is because these are the appliances that we're using to do this demo, and typically you would see RAID, RAID 5, RAID 6, whatever it may be configured in each node themselves. So we'll hit next. Now the next screen, we're going to create a virtual IP. The virtual IP is what we're going to use to connect from our ESX host to connect to for our iSCSI connections, which is the VIP for the cluster. So let's give this guy a virtual IP 192.168.202. Let's give it a 50 and subnet mask and OK. Not really sure why that's complaining, because that's the same subnet we're in, but anyway, we will find out. Click next. And right now we're going to skip volume creation, so we don't want to set those up right now. You can see our available cluster space is 94 gig across both nodes right now. Currently each VSA has 50 gigs of raw space. So we're going to click finish, and it's going to go on and it's going to create our cluster. As you can see over here, it's starting to create our management group and our cluster, adding our nodes. It's also going through and configuring username and passwords on the VSAs, all email settings, DNS settings, etc. And it is complete. So now it's given us a warning that we're not using a license. That's fine, because we have a, I believe it's a 60-day eval by default, which is plenty of time to set up our lab and do some testing and all that good stuff. So it's obviously taken much longer than I expected. And there we go. Summary screen gives us all the information we just created and assigned. showing our management group, our cluster size, the VIP that we used, which we should go ahead and test. Make sure we can ping that thing. And there you go. So we are now complete. We now have a management group called lab.local, and we have a cluster called lab cluster, which has 2 storage subsystems that we just created. And you can drill into these screens and get more details on anything that you may want to look at. Storage. You see, we just have one virtual disk right now, which is 50 gigs. When using the VSA, if you want to add additional storage to them, you have to configure the VSA and add additional storage to the VM itself. And you need to start with the disk on controller 1.0 and increment from there, versus 0.1, 0, etc. that way. It needs to be on controller 1. Otherwise the VSA will not pick up the disks. So now you can see, like I say, we've got some events up here. It's giving us a message about email not being set up because we didn't add email settings. You can click on the node. It's telling us that we have a alert systems running managers. Basically that's telling us that we need to have a FOM. Up here in the top you'll see it gives us information in regards to what the best config should be, the recommendations. Right here, 2 regular managers and a failover manager recommended. You can see the manager status on the 2 nodes. We have normal status, which means we are running the 2 regular managers. However, we didn't set up a failover manager. It'll function fine. Everything will work for this lab. It's fine to get that set up. So now if I go into volumes here, and this is where you would create your new volumes. So if you wanted to do that right now, you can do that. But what I would do first is go back into your individual nodes on IP settings, and you see we have 2 interfaces. Obviously interface Ethernet 0 is the one we configured during the configuration steps at the appliance themselves. You can go in and select those and create a new bond. You cannot do this in the VSA, but what you can do is you can edit Ethernet 1, let it pull an IP address. This in the VSA, Ethernet 1 is using the VMX Net 3 driver, which will give you much better throughput. And then what you would do is go into IP settings and you would select the SAN IQ interface. This is the interface that is used for communication and all your traffic for your iSCSI connections in from the ESX hosts. So let's go ahead and do that, even though I'm not going to go that detail right now. So we'll go ahead and configure Ethernet 1 to obtain an IP. I'll show you what this looks like. If these were physical nodes, you would have 2 Ethernet devices as well. Same thing, Ethernet 1 be disabled. However, you'd be able to select Ethernet 0 and Ethernet 1 and create a network bond. I typically will use ALB, adaptive load balancing. This config allows you to go across it's probably the most flexible, if you will. No special switch configuration changes need to be made. You don't have to create LACP trunks or ports or anything like that. You basically can plug one 1 gig connection into one switch, plug another one into another switch. You have failover, you have HA set up, configured for ALB, and it just works. So now, if you look at IP settings, we now have another IP interface is configured, VMXNet. So let's go ahead and select the SAN IQ interface, and we're going to choose Ethernet 1. Now it'll control that or configure that to allow the communications to happen through that. And you would go into your second node and do the same. So with that, I'm going to end for right now. I'll go into more detail at a later time, and we'll set up some volumes and map them over to the ESX host and set up iSCSI. Thanks.